Buffalo Hump took only one man with him when he went on to the Great Water. He took Worm, the medicine man. The glory of the great raid was over. The Comanches had harassed and murdered the Texans in town after town, and had even defeated a company of bluecoat soldiers who charged at them foolishly, not realizing how many warriors they faced. By then the Comanches were driving more than 1,000 stolen horses. The bluecoats managed to separate off a few of the horses, but then they had to leave them and flee for their lives. One soldier, whose horse went lame, fell behind. When his gun misfired, Blue Duck killed him with a lance, a thing that would have made Buffalo Hump proud had Blue Duck not spoiled his coup by bragging about it excessively around the campfire that night. It was no great feat to kill a white soldier whose horse was lame and whose gun wouldn't shoot. Blue Duck also bragged excessively about his rapes. Buffalo Hump had meant to take Blue Duck and a few warriors on to the Great Water, but after listening to Blue Duck brag, he decided to leave the boy, let him fight his way back to the plains. He did not want such a braggart with him. Many of the warriors were still crazy for blood. They did not want to stop killing just to see water. The morning after the chase with the bluecoat soldiers, Buffalo Hump decided to leave the war party and go alone with Worm to the Great Water. The raid had been a fine triumph. All the Texans knew again that the Comanche power was still great. The Texans were scattered and frightened. They had their dead to bury, their wounded to heal. The bluecoat soldiers would come in time to the Llano, but it would not be soon. Buffalo Hump spoke to some of the chiefs who had joined the raid with their warriors. He advised them to break into parties of 40 or 50 and filter back up to the plains along the old trails. The whites, if they pursued at all, which he doubted, would wear themselves out trying to decide which party to chase. When Blue Duck saw his father preparing to leave with only old Worm for a companion, he loped over and watched his father filling his quiver with arrows. Buffalo Hump had worked on the arrows most of the night, making sure that the arrowheads were tightly set. "I will come with you," Blue Duck said. "You might need me." "No, you go with the horses," Buffalo Hump instructed. "Keep them together and travel fast. Take them to the canyon and don't lose any. I will come in a few days with Worm." Blue Duck was annoyed. He was a warrior now. He had killed a bluecoat, and yet his father treated him like a horse herder. "What if the Texans trap you?" he asked. "You will not get much help from that old man." "I will not need much help," Buffalo Hump said. It wearied him to have to be always arguing with his son. The boy never accepted any command simply as an obedient son should. He always had words of his own to say about every request. Because Blue Duck was so rude, Buffalo Hump had to keep reminding himself that he was also brave. He was one of the bravest young men in the tribe. He too had been brave and daring when he was young, yet he had not been disrespectful. His own father was named Two Arrows. He had once killed the largest grizzly bear anyone had ever seen with only 2 arrows. Buffalo Hump would never have dared question anything Two Arrows told him to do. He seldom spoke to his father unless Two Arrows asked him something. He would not have dared be rude, as Blue Duck was rude. Blue Duck did not like being sent home with the horses. He sulked and pouted and insulted 2 young warriors, hoping to provoke a fight. Buffalo Hump saw it all, but he ignored it. He gathered his things, motioned to Worm, and left the camp. It was a relief to go. He had taken pride in being able once more to gather so many warriors that the whites could not stand before them. But now he felt the need to be alone, to move quietly across the land and just take care of himself, without having to mediate disputes and make decisions for so many warriors. Worm was old. He was a man of silence. He could speak prophecy and make spells, but mostly he was quiet and alert, a pleasure to travel with. For 2 days they traveled through the thick brush country, a country where there were many armadillos. Worm was particularly fond of armadillo meat. Also, the little scaly animal seemed to amuse him. Sometimes he would catch an armadillo that was half in its hold and would have to tickle its testicles to make it come out. When he cooked an armadillo, he carefully preserved the scaly case that had been the beast's defense. Soon he had several armadillo shells dangling from his pack. "Why do you like that meat so much?" Buffalo Hump asked him one night. They were only one camp from the great water. He himself had killed a javelina that afternoon and was eating it. In his view, pig was tastier by far than armadillo. Worm rarely answered a direct question directly. "The armadillo people are from a time before the Comanche," Worm said. "They were here when we were not. They are so old that they have learned to grow shells, and yet they are not slow like turtles." Worm paused. He was studying the paw of one of the armadillos he had killed. "If we could learn to grow shells, we would be safe in battle," he said. "If I eat enough of these armadillos, maybe I will grow a shell." "You have eaten several, and I don't see any shell on you," Buffalo Hump commented. Worm was silent. He preferred to think his own thoughts about the armadillo people. The next day they came to a country where the trees were low and inward bent from the constant push of the sea wind. The air was so salt Buffalo Hump could lick salt off his lips. The land became swampy, with tall reeds higher than a horse growing in dense thickets. There were inlets of water here and there with cranes and great storks standing in them. As they grew nearer the sea, both the land and the air were alive with birds. Geese and ducks in great numbers floated on the inlets or waddled through the grass. There were white gulls that rose and dipped. But the most interesting to Buffalo Hump were the great cranes. They came from far in the north and did not stop in the Comanche country. Once in Nebraska, on the Platte River, he had seen a few of the great cranes, but in the swamps and inlets near the great water there were thousands of them. Worm seemed in awe of the birds. His old eyes widened when the storks flapped into the air or when the herons sailed down to the water on their wide wings. He turned his head from side to side and listened when the seagulls spoke. It was as if he were trying to learn their language. Worm had only half an upper lip. The other half had been cut off years before in battle. When he was excited, he licked his half lip. It was a thing he did too when his interest in a woman was high. The women of the tribe joked about it. They could always tell when old Worm needed a woman because he licked his lip. All his wives had died of one illness or another. There was a story about him from the old days that the old women told the young women to inform them about the vengefulness of men. Worm had once had a wife who would not open her legs when he wanted her. To teach her obedience, Worm had made a great black cactus grow out of her womb, a cactus with thorns so sharp that the woman could never close her legs again, but had to walk with them widespread even when she was only doing chores. Buffalo Hump had heard the story from Hair on the Lip and did not believe it. "I have been with this tribe since I was born," he said. "I have never seen a woman waddling around with a cactus sticking out of her." "Oh no, a bear took that woman. You were just a child then," Hair on the Lip assured him. Buffalo Hump still did not believe her, but he did like most of the stories Hair on the Lip told. Many of her stories were about things that happened to humans while they were coupling. Such stories seldom failed to amuse him. After wading through several inlets, frightening many birds off the water, Buffalo Hump and Worm at last came to the long strip of sand that bordered the great water. They rode along the edge of the great water for many miles. Buffalo Hump liked to ride on the wet sand, so close to the sea that the waves foamed over the hooves of his horse as the waves died. Worm, though, would not come near the great water. He kept his horse far back at the edge of the sand, where sand gave way to grass. He tried repeatedly to point out to Buffalo Hump that the great water was unsafe to approach, but Buffalo Hump ignored him. He rode where he wanted to ride. "There are great fish in the water and snakes as long as the tallest pine tree," Worm insisted. "One of those snakes might wrap its tongue around you and pull you under." Buffalo Hump paid no attention to Worm and his talk. Despite Worm's protest, he camped that night on the sandy beach. The air at night was warm and salty. He built a small fire of driftwood and sang as the fire died. Worm finally came and sat with him. They shared a little of the javelina meat. Worm still worried that the water might somehow engulf them. "That water is never still," he told Buffalo Hump suspiciously. "It is always moving." Buffalo Hump shrugged. He liked it that the water moved, that the waves came in and went out. He liked the sound it made, a sound that came from depths he could not see. "I like the land. It doesn't move," Worm said. "This water sighs like a woman who is sad." There was some truth in that comment, Buffalo Hump thought. The ocean did sigh like a woman as she sighed in sorrow or at the slowing of her passion. "There are great fish in that water, with mouths so wide they can swallow buffaloes," Worm worried. Buffalo Hump sang over Worm's droning, his complaints. He sang much of the night in the warm salt air. In the gray mist before the dawn, Buffalo Hump got on his horse and sat waiting for the sun. On impulse, he forced the horse into the water and made him swim until the small waves broke over them. Then he swam back to land. Worm was beside himself when he saw Buffalo Hump in the water. He was worried about the snake as long as a pine tree, but Buffalo Hump had no such worry. He merely wanted to watch the sun rise out of the water. All his life he had watched the sun rise upward out of the prairie. Now he wanted to see it come out of the water. When it came, at first it was only a faint glow in the grayness of water and sky. "We had better move back there in those trees," Worm said when Buffalo Hump came out. "Why?" Buffalo Hump asked. "They say the sun rides all night on the back of a great fish," Worm said. "When it is time for morning, the great fish brings it back so it can shine on the people of the land and make them warm." In the mist it was hard to see the sun clearly. Buffalo Hump wondered if there was a great fish so large that it could carry the sun. He watched the surface of the water and saw no great fish, though that didn't mean that the story was untrue. The sun was now well up. Maybe the great fish that carried it had gone back to its home in the deep water. Maybe the fish slept all day while the people of the land enjoyed the sun. He didn't know. What Buffalo Hump did know was that the ocean was a great mystery. In his country, the stars and the moon were the great mysteries. He had been studying them all his life, and yet he knew nothing of the stars and the moon. The ocean was such a mystery, too. He could live his life on the sand, as the Indians of the seaside did, and yet never know the secrets of the ocean. Why its waves moved in and out, why it sighed like a woman. Perhaps the ocean was even more powerful than the moon and stars. After all, it had called him to it, across hundreds of miles of land. Although the fighting had been good, he had finally grown restive with it. He did not want to delay any longer his trip to the great water. When the sun was high, Buffalo Hump rode back to Worm, who was crouched nervously over the little campfire. Often Worm could be irritating, a cranky man with half an upper lip and many fears and complaints. But Worm, for all his complaining, was a powerful prophet, and sometimes his clearest prophecies were called forth by his fears. Buffalo Hump wanted a prophecy. All through the fighting he had wanted one, for his feelings were not good. Although he had felt again the excitement of war and the thrill of running down and killing his enemies, there had been a sadness in him through it all. At night, as the young men sang and bragged of their killing, he had felt apart and could not make the sadness leave. In his life he had had many victories. The young men bragging and singing were as he had been in his youth, brave and unthinking. They expected that they would live their life as warriors and have many victories over the whites and the Mexicans. In their dreams and in their songs they saw themselves as Comanche warriors always, men of the bow and of the horse. Buffalo Hump knew, though, that for most of them it would not be that way. A warrior skilled with the lance and the bow might, if he were bold, prevail over a man with a gun, but 1,000 men with guns, whether they were skilled or not, would win in a battle against even the bravest warriors with bows. His son, Blue Duck, though foolish and rude, would have to fight with the gun if he were to live. Buffalo Hump knew that the blue-coat soldiers would come in thousands someday. Their defeat would sting. They would try to reverse the Comanche victory. They would not come this year, but they would come. There were as many of them as there had once been buffalo. It was a bitter truth, but a truth. The young warriors who were even then stringing white scalps on their lances would either die in battle or end their days as old Slow Tree had predicted, growing corn on little patches of land the white men let them keep. Buffalo Hump wanted to see the ocean because the ocean would always be as it was. Few things could stay forever in the way they were when the spirits made them. Even the great plains of grass, the home of the people, would not be always as it had been. The whites would bring their plows and scar the earth. They would put their cattle on it, and the cattle would bring the ugly mesquite trees. The grass that had been high forever would be trampled and torn. The Llano would not be always as it had been. The ocean and the stars were eternal, things whose power and mystery were greater than the powers of men. Long before, when Buffalo Hump was a boy, his own grandmother had predicted the end of the Comanche people. She thought it would come through sickness and plague, and indeed sickness and plague had carried off almost half the people. Now, looking at the great water, Buffalo Hump wanted to know if Worm had a prophecy that would tell him how the next years would be. He got off his horse and sat for a few minutes with the old man, Worm. It was Worm who had said that the pox and the shitting sickness were caused by gold. He had a vision in which he saw a river of gold flowing out of a mountain to the west. The whites ran through their country like ants, seeking the gold, and left their sicknesses behind them. "I will take you away from this water you dislike so much if you will tell me a prophecy," Buffalo Hump said. "I won't let a great fish get you either, or a snake as long as a pine tree." "I have the vision now," Worm said. "Last night I could not sleep because I heard too many horses squealing in my head." "I heard no horses squeal," Buffalo Hump said. Then he realized he had made a foolish comment. Worm was not talking about their horses, but about the horses in his vision. "It was not these horses with us," Worm said. "It was the horses we have taken in the raid, and the others, the horses at home." "Why did they squeal? Was there a cougar near?" Buffalo Hump asked. "They were squealing because they were dying," Worm said. "The white men were killing them all, and the sky was black, but it was not a storm. The sky was black because all the buzzards in the world had come to eat our horses. There were so many buzzards flying over that I could not see the sun. All I could see were black wings." "Is that the whole prophecy?" Buffalo Hump asked. Worm merely nodded. He seemed tired and sad. "That is a terrible prophecy. We need our horses," Buffalo Hump said. "Eat a little of this meat, then we will go." "We will have to slip along at night," Worm said. "All the whites will be looking for us now." "Eat your meat," Buffalo Hump said. "Don't worry about the whites. I'm going to take you up the Rio Grande. Once we are far enough up it, we can go home along the old war trail we used to ride when we went into Mexico and caught all those Mexicans. I don't think we will see many whites out that way. If we do see whites, I will kill them." Worm was relieved. They had traveled far on the great raid, all the way from the Llano to the sea. He did not care for the sea, he was tired, and he had no more armadillo meat to eat. But Buffalo Hump gave him a little of his pig meat, and he ate it. When Worm had eaten, Buffalo Hump mounted and led him inland, back through the twisted trees, toward Mexico. "It's such a far way back, Woodrow," Augustus said. "I swear I wish we hadn't gone so far from town." He said it at night, as they were burying two men whose scalped and cut open bodies they found just at dusk at the foot of a small hill. The two men had been traveling in a little wagon with nothing much in it except axes. The Indians hadn't destroyed the wagon, but they had used the axes to hack the two men open. "It's far yet, and we can't make no time for burying folks," Long Bill observed. The three older rangers watched as P.I., Dietz, and Jake Spoon dug the grave. The day before, they had found a family slaughtered by a poor little tent. Evidently, they had intended to start a farm. There were 2 women among the 6 dead. Seeing the women, whom they wrapped in blankets and buried properly, put Gus in mind of Clara, Long Bill in mind of his Pearl, and Call in mind of Maggie. It would be many days before they knew whether their womenfolk had suffered the fate of the 2 young women just buried, and the anxiety was tiring them all. For 3 days they had pushed the horses to their limits, and yet they were still 10 days from home. At night, none of the older men could sleep. Images rose up in their minds, images that kept them tense. Call usually went off with his rifle and sat in the darkness. Long Bill and Gus stayed by the fire, talking about anything they could think to talk about. P.I., Jake, and Dietz, with no one at home to worry about, said little. Jake had thrown up at the sight of the mutilated bodies. "I never seen how a person looks inside themselves before," he said to P.I., who didn't reply. P.I. was afraid to talk about the deaths for fear that he would cry and embarrass himself before the older men. The sight of dead people made so much sadness come in him that he feared he couldn't contain it. In death, people looked so small. The dead adults looked like sad children, and the dead children looked like dolls. The fury that found them was so great that it reduced them as they died. "Why will people come out here, Captain?" Jake asked as they were burying the 2 men who were traveling in the small wagon. "This ain't farm country. What could you grow out here?" Call had often wondered the same thing himself. Over and over, rangering, he and Augustus had come upon little families far out beyond the settlements, attempting to farm country that had never felt the plow. Often such pioneers didn't even have a plow. They might have a churn, a spindle, a spade, and a few axes, an almanac, and a primer for the children. Mainly what they had, as far as Call could tell, was their energies and their hopes. At least they had what most of them had never had before, land they could call their own. "You can't stop people from coming out here," Call said. "It's open country now." Later, Call and Augustus walked off from the group a little distance to discuss the problem of Long Bill, who was so distraught at the thought his Pearl might have been killed or kidnapped that he seemed to be losing his mind. "Bill's always been steady," Call said. "I wouldn't have expected him to get this bad." "He's bad, Woodrow," Gus said. "I guess he's as crazy about Pearl as I am about Clara." The fact was, Call himself had had a number of disquieting thoughts about Maggie since hearing about the raid. Maggie had tried 3 times to talk about the baby she was carrying, a baby she claimed was his, but in his haste to round up his troop and get them started, he had put her off, a rudeness he regretted. Now Maggie might be dead, and the child too, if there really was a child. "I mean to leave Texas forever if Clara's dead," Augustus told him. "I wouldn't want to live here without my Clara. The memories would be too hard." Call refrained from commenting that the woman Gus was talking about wasn't his anymore. If Clara had left Austin before the big raid, it was because she had married Bob Allen. "Let's get off the damn Brazos tomorrow," Gus suggested. "Why?" Call asked. "There's always abundant water in the Brazos." "I know it, that's why," Augustus said. "Where there's water, there's farmers, or people who are trying to be farmers. It means more people to bury. Me, I'd like to get on home." "It's wrong to leave Christian folk unburied," Call told him. "It ain't if we don't even see 'em," Gus said. "If we get away from all this watered country, we won't happen on so many." It was a still, windless night, and very dark. The 3 young gravediggers had to bring burning sticks from the campfire in order to determine if they had the grave deep enough. The spades they were digging with had belonged to the 2 men who were murdered. "We could start a hardware store with all the spades and axes scattered around out here," Gus remarked. Long Bill had not come out with them to the grave site. They could see his tall form pacing back and forth in front of the campfire, making wavy shadows. "Oh, St. Peter!" they heard him exclaim. "Oh, St. Paul!" "I wish Billy would hear some new saints to pray to," Gus said. "I'm tired of hearing him pray to Peter and Paul." "He can't read. I guess he's forgot the other saints," Call said. The gravediggers had paused for a moment. They were all exhausted from hard travel and from fear. Call felt sorry for Long Bill Coleman. Seldom had he seen a man so broken by grief, though Pearl, the woman he grieved for, might well be alive and well. Pearl, though large, did not seem to him exceptional in any way. She had none of Clara's wit or spirit, nor Maggie's beauty of face. Pearl must be a mighty good cook for him to take on about her so before he even knows that she's dead. "No, she ain't," Augustus said. "I've had Pearl's cooking, and it was only fair. I expect it's the pokin'." "The what?" Call asked, surprised. "The pokin', Woodrow," Gus said. "Pearl was large, and large women are usually a pleasure to poke." "Well, you would think that," Call said. In the aftermath of the Great Raid, much to her distress, Maggie's business increased. No one knew exactly where the Comanches were, but rumors of widespread carnage swept the town. Some said that Buffalo Hump had killed 300 people in San Antonio and 100 more in Houston. Then a counter-rumor reversed those numbers. Others thought he had burnt Victoria, while someone had heard that he was already in Mexico. There was a general fear that he might come back through Austin and finish what he had begun. Men went about heavily armed, draped with all the weapons they could carry. At night the streets were empty, though the saloons still did a good business. Men were so scared that they drank, and having drunk, discovered that they were still too nervous to sleep. So they came to Maggie, a stream of men, knocking on her door at all hours of the day or night. She couldn't protest, but she was not welcoming either. She had been sickly of a morning lately, and was often nauseous or queasy during the day. Her belly had begun to swell visibly, yet none of the men seemed to notice. They were so scared that only what she sold them could bring them a little peace. Maggie understood it. She was scared herself. Some nights she even went down and hid in the crawl space under the smokehouse. It brought her a little relief, both from fear and from the men. Maggie longed for Woodrow to show up with the boys. Once Woodrow was there, the men would leave her be. Although they were only 2 men, they were respected. The townspeople took much comfort from their presence, just as she did. Every morning at first light, Maggie looked out her window toward the corrals where the rangers kept their horses. She was hoping to see Woodrow's buckskin, Johnny. If she could just spot Johnny, she would know that he was back. But morning after morning, there was no sign of the rangers. Maggie found Call's absence almost too much to bear at such a time, with the baby in her. Just as she was hoping to give up whoring forever, all the men wanted her to do was whore, and she was afraid to refuse. The dark thought struck her that Woodrow might be dead. He had left with only 5 men, and the Comanches numbered more than 500, some said. The rangers might all be dead, and likely were. Even to think it made Maggie feel hopeless. If Woodrow was dead, she would have no father for her baby. Then the whoring wouldn't stop. The men at the door, the men on top of her, the men who counted out money and waited for her to lay back and pull up her skirt. She would go on laying there, lifting her skirt to men who were none too clean, who stank and vomited, who had violence in their eyes, until she got sick or was too old to be worth the money they counted out. She thought she could have borne all the worry and all the doubt a little better if Woodrow had just had time to talk to her about the baby, to give her some hope that he would marry her or at least help her with the child. He hadn't seemed to be angry about it. Just a few words would have been enough. But he had been in a hurry. Usually was. Maggie could not find it in her to tax Woodrow too hard for his failure to speak. She rarely taxed Woodrow too hard about any of the things that bothered her. He was a captain now and had many responsibilities. Her hope was that he would come round to liking the idea of a child, or at least to not minding it much. When Woodrow Call did get angry with her, a coldness showed in him that made her question whether happiness would ever be hers. He could be so cold when angered that Maggie wondered how she had ever come to care for him anyway. He had only been a customer, after all, a young man with quick needs like many another. The older whores had all warned her not to get attached to customers. One named Florrie, who had taught her something of the business, had been emphatic on that score. "I've known whores to marry, but it's a seldom thing," Florrie said. It's one of those things that if you look for them, you won't find them." "Well, I ain't looking," Maggie declared. She had been much younger then. It wasn't entirely true. She had already met Woodrow Call and already knew she liked him. "I looked once, but not no more," Florrie said. "I just take their money and give 'em a few jerks. It don't take much longer than it takes to wring out a mop, not if you set your hips right." The next year, Florrie stumbled coming down her own steps and broke her neck. She had a big basket of laundry in her arms. It was the laundry that caused her to misstep. She was lying dead at the bottom of the steps with her eyes wide open when they found her. A goat had wandered over and was eating her laundry basket, which was made of coarse straw. Maggie, despite Florrie's advice, had gone on and got attached to Woodrow Call, so attached that she would sometimes put her hand on her belly and imagine that there was a little boy inside who would look just like him. One morning, when she had gone out early to draw a bucket of water, she was surprised to see the sheriff limping up her stairs. The sheriff was named Gawsworth Gibbons. He was a large man and, in the main, kindly. Several times he had taken Maggie's side in disputes with drunken customers, a rare thing for a sheriff to do. Despite Gaw Gibbons' kindly attitude, Maggie was always a little disturbed to see a sheriff coming up her stairs. It could mean she was going to be asked to move or some such thing. The sheriff had a bad limp, the result of a wound sustained in the Mexican War. It took him some time to mount the stairs. All Maggie could do was stand and wait, wondering what she could have done to prompt a visit from the sheriff. "Why, what is it, Gaw?" she asked. She had known Gawsworth Gibbons long before he became a sheriff. Before the Mexican War, he had made his living shoeing horses. "Has somebody complained?" she asked. Gawsworth Gibbons smiled his large, kindly smile and followed Maggie into her room before answering. "No complaints, Mag," he told her. "All that's wrong is just what's apt to be wrong with any feller." To her shock, Maggie saw that he had money in his hand. He was coming to her as a customer, something that had never happened in the years she had known him. It took her a moment to adjust to the notion. The sheriff, out of consideration, turned his back as he lowered his pants. Even from the back, though, Maggie saw that the skin on his legs was twisted in a strange way. The skin had black specks in it, as if Gaw Gibbons had been peppered. Then she recalled that what she had heard about his war wound was that he had been severely burned. A keg of gunpowder had blown up while he stood near it, blowing gunpowder and bits of the barrel into his legs. "My wife, she's about give up on me, Mag," the sheriff said. "I expect she just can't tolerate these burned legs no more." "Oh, Gaw," Maggie said. The fact that he spoke so sorrowfully when he mentioned his wife made the business at hand a little less hard.